November 1st, 1944, 0700 hours. Shimoi Anti-Aircraft Battery, Western Tokyo. Captain Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his binoculars against his face, scanning the crystalline morning sky above the Nakajima aircraft complex. His Type 88 75mm gun stood ready behind him, its barrel elevated to maximum angle, while his 7-man crew waited at their positions. The battery had received urgent orders at dawn, American aircraft inbound, high-altitude reconnaissance. Yamamoto had commanded this position for 18 months, protecting the vital engine factories that powered Japan's dwindling air force. His gun, designated 828 for the year 2588 in the imperial calendar, when it entered service 1928 by Western counting, had been considered adequate when first deployed. Now, in the autumn of 1944, it represented obsolescence incarnate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sound reached them first, not the familiar growl of Japanese engines or even the distinctive drone of American carrier-based aircraft. This was different, deeper, a resonant mechanical thunder that seemed to emanate from the stratosphere itself. Then Yamamoto saw it. A single silver speck, impossibly high, trailing 4 thin contrails across the azure sky. The aircraft moved with deliberate slowness at 32,000 feet, methodically photographing the very factories Yamamoto was sworn to defend. His rangefinder operator called out the altitude, 9,700 meters, nearly 10,000 meters above sea level. Yamamoto did not need to consult his gun tables. He had memorized them long ago, along with the bitter mathematics they contained. His Type 88 had an effective ceiling of 7,250 meters. Maximum vertical range, achieved only under perfect conditions with brand new barrels and premium ammunition, reached perhaps 8,850 meters. The American aircraft cruising overhead might as well have been on the moon. Nevertheless, orders were orders. Yamamoto commanded his crew to commence firing. The gun recoiled with its familiar violence, sending a 6.5 kilogram high explosive shell climbing toward the intruder at 585 meters per second. 15 seconds later, the shell detonated far below the target, its fragments falling harmlessly back to Earth. The black puff of smoke appeared at approximately 7,000 meters, nearly 3,000 meters short of the American aircraft. Yamamoto's battery fired 18 more rounds over the next 20 minutes, each shell describing the same futile arc into the sky, each detonation marking another failure. Other batteries across Tokyo joined the barrage. Hundreds of shells climbed skyward. Not one came close to the reconnaissance aircraft that continued its methodical photography, the pilot surely watching the impotent display below with professional detachment. By 0730, the aircraft had completed its mission and turned south, disappearing over the horizon. Yamamoto lowered his binoculars and looked at the 19 spent shell casings scattered around his gun position. Each round represented resources Japan could barely afford. Each firing had accomplished precisely nothing except to demonstrate to his crew and to the thousands of Tokyo civilians who had watched from streets and rooftops that Japanese defenses were powerless against this new American capability. That afternoon, Yamamoto filed his after-action report to the 3rd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment headquarters. The document contained 9 words that would be repeated, with variations, in hundreds of similar reports over the following months. Enemy aircraft altitude exceeded maximum effective range of available weapons. The Americans had named their reconnaissance aircraft Tokyo Rose after the propaganda broadcaster. The Japanese would come to call B-29's superfortress raids something else entirely, the altitude we cannot reach. It was not poetry, it was mathematical fact, written in trajectories and explosive yields and the fundamental physics of artillery fire that no amount of courage or determination could overcome. The Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft gun entered service in 1928, when the Japanese Army Technical Bureau had amalgamated features from several foreign designs particularly the British Vickers QF 3-inch 20 hundredweight gun from World War I. At the time of its introduction, the weapon had been considered equal to any contemporary anti-aircraft gun in Western armies. It replaced the earlier Type 11 75mm gun and was deemed capable of handling any targets the Japanese army was likely to encounter on the Asian mainland. The gun's characteristics reflected the aviation technology of its era. A single-piece barrel mounted on a central pedestal, supported by 5 legs that folded for transport, semi-automatic horizontal sliding breech that opened to the right, hydraulic recoil brake and hydropneumatic buffer contained in a trough-shaped cradle. Tactical deployment called for 4-gun field batteries. A well-trained crew could achieve 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The complete system weighed approximately 2,700 kilograms in firing position. Most significantly, the Type 88 could hurl its projectile to an effective ceiling of 7,250 meters, approximately 23,790 feet. In 1928, when military aircraft struggled to exceed 12,000 feet in combat operations, this represented adequate defensive capability. By 1931, when Type 88 guns first saw action in Manchuria, aviation technology was already beginning to outpace their reach. Through the Second Sino-Japanese War, beginning in 1937, and during the brief Japanese-Soviet border conflicts of the late 30s, the Type 88 remained viable. Chinese and Soviet aircraft of that era operated predominantly at medium altitudes well within the gun's engagement envelope. Japanese gunners achieved reasonable success rates. The weapon's limitations, while increasingly apparent to technical experts, had not yet become strategically critical. By 1941, however, the Type 88 was fundamentally obsolete. Aircraft performance had improved dramatically. The latest bombers from Britain, America, and Germany routinely operated above 25,000 feet. Japan's primary anti-aircraft gun, of which over 2,000 would eventually be produced more than any other medium anti-aircraft weapon in the Japanese inventory, could no longer reliably reach modern aircraft operating at combat altitudes. Allied intelligence, initially confused by the Type 88 designation, assumed the weapon must be related to Germany's formidable 88mm flak guns. The names seemed too similar to be coincidental. In reality, there was no connection whatsoever. The Japanese 88 referred to the imperial year of adoption, not the weapon's caliber. The Japanese gun fired 75mm shells. The German 88 fired 88mm rounds and possessed dramatically superior performance. Germany's 8.8 cm flak 18, 36, and 37 guns achieved effective ceilings around 8,000 meters, 26,247 feet. Their improved Flak 41 model, introduced in 1943, reached 11,300 meters, effectively 37,100 feet. Even the standard German flak guns outperformed Japan's most numerous anti-aircraft weapon by nearly 3,000 feet. The advanced German guns exceeded Japanese capabilities by over 13,000 feet. American and British heavy anti-aircraft guns demonstrated similar superiority. The United States 90mm M1 gun achieved effective ceilings of 10,600 meters. Britain's QF 3.7-inch Mark III reached the same height. The Italian Cannone da 90/53 could engage targets effectively at 12,000 meters, 39,000 feet. All these weapons incorporated modern fire control systems, advanced optical rangefinders, and in Allied cases by 1944, radar direction. Japan possessed nothing comparable in quantity. The Imperial Army recognized this gap. Beginning in the late 1930s, Japanese engineers worked desperately to develop improved anti-aircraft weapons. The effort would produce several designs, each progressively more capable, and each arriving too late and in too few numbers to matter. The Type 99 88mm gun represented Japan's first attempt to close the altitude gap. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japanese forces captured several German-made SKC-30 naval guns from Chinese nationalist forces. These weapons, originally manufactured for Germany's Kriegsmarine as dual-purpose naval guns, demonstrated range and firepower far superior to the domestic Type 88. The Japanese Army Technical Bureau moved quickly. Engineers reverse-engineered the captured German guns and placed them into production. The result was the Type 99, designated for the imperial year 25/99/1939 in the Gregorian calendar. The Type 99 fired a 9-kilogram high explosive projectile to an effective altitude of 10,420 meters, 34,190 feet. On paper, this represented a dramatic improvement. The gun could theoretically engage high-flying bombers that the Type 88 could not touch. Approximately 946 Type 99 guns were built between 1939 and 1945. This number, while respectable in isolation, proved grossly inadequate to defend Japan's sprawling territory and industrial centers. For comparison, Germany produced over 21,000 88mm flak guns during the war. The United States manufactured tens of thousands of 90mm anti-aircraft guns. Japan's production of under 1,000 guns, capable of reaching modern bomber altitudes, left vast gaps in defensive coverage. Moreover, the Type 99 shared vulnerabilities common to all time-fused anti-aircraft artillery. Hitting fast-moving aircraft at high altitude required gunners to calculate lead, elevation, and fuse timing with extraordinary precision. The shell had to detonate at exactly the right moment in three-dimensional space to place fragments within lethal range of the target. Even with radar direction, which most Japanese batteries lacked, success rates remained dismally low. Heavy anti-aircraft guns typically required over 1,000 rounds fired to achieve a single aircraft destroyed. The Type 3 12-centimeter gun, introduced in 1943, represented Japan's most serious attempt to counter high-altitude bombers. Designated Type 3 for the imperial year 2603, the weapon was specifically designed to engage American B-29 superfortresses that had begun appearing over Japanese-controlled territory. The Type 3 mounted a single-piece barrel with sliding breech on a central pedestal, supported by 5 adjustable legs. It featured power controls and semi-automated fuse setting on the loading tray, making it Japan's most modern heavy anti-aircraft gun. The weapon could fire approximately 20 rounds per minute and send shells to a maximum altitude of 14,000 meters, 45,931 feet. On paper, the Type 3 could reach B-29 bombers, cruising at 30,000 feet. In practice, several factors limited its effectiveness. First, only 120 Type 3 guns were ever produced. Between 1943 and 1945, as American bombing intensified and Japan's need for effective anti-aircraft defenses became desperate, Japanese industry managed to manufacture an average of 4 guns per month. The reason was straightforward. Japan's industrial base, already strained by years of war, lacked the raw materials and manufacturing capacity to produce complex heavy artillery in quantity. Each Type 3 gun required sophisticated metallurgy, precision machining, and quality control that Japanese factories struggled to provide. American bombing raids targeting Japanese industry compounded the problem, disrupting in production just when defense requirements were most critical. Most Type 3 guns were retained on the home islands, deployed around Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and the Yawata Steel Works in Kitakyushu. A handful went to defend oil fields at Palembang in the Dutch East Indies. Units in Tokyo were credited with downing at least 10 B-29 bombers, a respectable tally, but strategically meaningless when hundreds of superfortresses attacked in single missions. The Type 5 15-centimeter anti-aircraft gun represented the pinnacle of Japanese heavy anti-aircraft development and the clearest demonstration of Japan's inability to translate engineering capability in production reality. Development began in early 1944, using the Type 3 design as a basis. By June 1945, 2 Type 5 guns had been built, one at Osaka Arsenal, one by Japan Steel Works. Both were deployed in the Suginami area on Tokyo's outskirts. 2 guns, to defend a nation of 70 million people and an empire spanning millions of square miles. The Type 5 could effectively engage B-29's throughout their operational altitude range. It arrived exactly 18 months too late, and in quantities so microscopic as to be militarily irrelevant. The two guns that existed fired a handful of missions before Japan's surrender. Their combat record, if any, remains unknown. Captain Yamamoto's experience on November 1, 1944, watching helplessly as an American reconnaissance aircraft photographed Tokyo from unreachable altitude, was replicated thousands of times over the following 9 months. Each incident drove home the same brutal lesson. Japan's anti-aircraft defenses, built around guns designed for the aviation technology of the 1920s and early 30s, were systemically inadequate against modern American heavy bombers. The mathematics were inescapable. B-29 superfortresses, when operating at their designed altitude of 30,000 feet or above, flew nearly 6,000 feet above the effective ceiling of Type 88 guns that comprised the vast majority of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery. They flew at the extreme edge of Type 99 capabilities, where hit probability approached zero. Even the rare Type 3 guns required near-perfect conditions and exceptional crew performance to achieve kills. This altitude advantage was not accidental. It was engineered into the B-29 from its inception, made possible by specific American technological achievements that Japan could not replicate. The disparity in anti-aircraft gun performance reflected a broader industrial and technological gap that would determine the war's outcome as surely as any battle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The industrial chasm separating Japanese and American anti-aircraft capabilities revealed itself not merely in gun performance specifications, but in the systematic organization of production that made those specifications achievable at scale. Japan's inability to manufacture adequate anti-aircraft defenses stemmed from the same fundamental weaknesses that would doom its entire war effort. Limited industrial capacity, insufficient raw materials, lack of advanced manufacturing techniques, and most critically, the cumulative effect of American strategic bombing that destroyed the very factories needed to produce defensive weapons. Lieutenant Fumio Niwa, an engineering officer assigned to evaluate captured American equipment, spent weeks in early 1945 examining components recovered from crashed B-29 bombers. His detailed reports, preserved in Japanese military archives, paint a picture of technological despair. Niwa described American manufacturing precision that seemed impossible given Japan's industrial capabilities. Components machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. High-temperature alloys far superior to anything Japanese metallurgy produced. Automated testing equipment that verified every part before installation. Niwa's analysis extended beyond individual components to the systematic nature of American production. He estimated that a single B-29 contained over 55,000 individual parts, each manufactured to exacting standards, each requiring quality control beyond Japanese capacity. When informed that American factories were producing over 200 B-29s monthly by 1945, Niwa reportedly told colleagues that such production rates would require Japan to dedicate its entire industrial base solely to bomber production impossible when Japan simultaneously needed to manufacture fighters, ships, tanks, ammunition, and every other weapon of modern warfare. The same, industrial, limitations that prevented Japan from matching American bomber production also prevented adequate anti-aircraft gun manufacturing. A single Type 3 12-centimeter gun required approximately 8 weeks to manufacture under optimal conditions. This assumed availability of special steel alloys for the barrel, precision machining equipment capable of boring and rifling the tube to exact specifications, skilled workers to assemble fire control mechanisms, and uninterrupted factory operations. By late 1944, none of these conditions existed. Special steel was desperately scarce, allocated primarily to aircraft engine production, Precision machining equipment, much of it imported from Germany before the war, was wearing out without replacement parts. Skilled workers had been conscripted into the military or killed in air raids, and factory operations were anything but uninterrupted. American B-29 raids specifically targeted Japanese industrial centers, creating a vicious cycle. The more Japan needed anti-aircraft guns, the less capable it became of producing them. The Osaka Arsenal, one of Japan's premier ordnance facilities, produced Type 3 guns at a rate of approximately 6 per month in early 1944. By January 1945, monthly production had fallen to 2 guns. By March, production essentially ceased as repeated B-29 raids destroyed machine tools, killed workers, and disrupted transportation networks that supplied raw materials. The Arsenal's final monthly report, filed in May 1945, noted that all heavy gun production had stopped entirely. Workers were being reassigned to repair existing weapons and manufacture small arms ammunition. Japan's failure to produce adequate anti-aircraft defenses was matched by its inability to develop effective fire control systems. American and British anti-aircraft batteries by 1944 operated with radar direction that provided accurate range, altitude, and speed data for incoming bombers. Gunners could track targets invisible through cloud cover or darkness. Computers mechanical in this era, but sophisticated nonetheless calculated firing solutions automatically, dramatically improving hit probability. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries relied primarily on optical rangefinders and mechanical predictors that required clear visibility and manual calculation. Radar sets existed but remained primitive and scarce. Most batteries transmitted firing corrections vocally, gunners adjusting aim based on shouted instructions. Some units had implemented electrical data transmission systems, but these were the exception rather than the rule. The technological sophistication gap between Allied and Japanese fire control was as significant as the gap in gun performance. November 24, 1944. 111 B-29 superfortresses launched from newly operational bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, targeting the Nakajima aircraft engine plant in Musashino, western Tokyo. This represented the first major strategic bombing raid on Tokyo from the Mariana Islands, and the beginning of a campaign that would devastate Japanese industrial capacity over the following 9 months. The bomber stream approached Tokyo at altitudes between 28,000 and 32,000 feet. Japanese radar operators detected the formation while still over the Pacific. Air raid sirens wailed across the city. Anti-aircraft batteries manned their guns. Fighter units scrambled interceptors. Everything Japan could deploy to defend its capital rose to meet the threat. Sergeant Shoji Suzuki, commanding a Type 88 battery positioned near the Musashino plant, recorded the engagement in his diary. His unit opened fire at maximum range as lead B-29's came overhead. The guns fired continuously for 18 minutes, expending 137 rounds. Suzuki watched through binoculars as his shells detonated thousands of feet below the bomber formation, creating a field of black bursts that marked only futility. Other batteries with Type 99 guns achieved better altitude reach, but still struggled to achieve hits. The few shells that detonated near bombers faced another problem. B-29 construction incorporated redundant systems and substantial armor protection around critical components. Crews operated in pressurized compartments that offered protection against fragments. Engine nacelles were designed to contain failures and resist damage. The superfortress structure could absorb punishment that would destroy Japanese aircraft, continuing to fly with multiple holes, damaged engines, even substantial portions of control surfaces shot away. Suzuki's diary entry for November 24th contains a sentence that would be echoed in hundreds of similar accounts. American bombers flew where our guns could not reach them, and when our shells did reach, the bombers seemed to ignore the damage. This represented the fundamental reality of Japanese anti-aircraft defense in late 1944. Inadequate weapons engaging nearly indestructible targets, operating at unreachable altitudes. The November 24th raid achieved mixed results. High winds the jet stream, though not yet understood by American planners, scattered bombs across Tokyo. The Musashino plant sustained minimal damage, but the psychological impact on Japanese defenders and civilians was devastating. 111 American bombers had flown over the capital, dropping hundreds of tons of explosives, and Japanese defenses had shot down not a single aircraft. Japanese fighter interception proved marginally more effective than anti-aircraft fire, but only marginally. Nakajima Ki, 44 fighters from the 47th Sentai, specifically tasked with defending Tokyo, managed to reach the B-29 formations, but struggled to maintain a position at operational altitude. Japanese fighters designed for agility at medium altitudes suffered dramatic performance degradation in thin air above 25,000 feet. Engines lost power, control surfaces became mushy, pilots hypoxic from inadequate oxygen systems made poor tactical decisions. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi, leading the 244th Sentai during later raids, documented in his unit reports that Japanese fighters could barely maintain level flight at altitudes where B-29's operated comfortably. The American bombers' speed at altitude approximately 350 miles per hour matched what Japanese interceptors could achieve in maximum power climbs at 28,000 feet. This meant fighters that managed to reach bombing altitude had virtually no speed advantage for attack runs. They could not pursue fleeing bombers. They could not disengage from defensive fire. They were reduced to single-pass attacks that rarely inflicted critical damage. The altitude gap created by American turbocharger technology, by pressurized crew compartments, by structural engineering that allowed heavy bombers to operate efficiently in stratospheric air, had rendered Japanese defenses largely impotent. Anti-aircraft guns could not reach the targets. Fighters could not effectively engage them. Japan's vaunted fighting spirit, its pilots' willingness to die, its soldiers' determination, none of these intangibles could overcome the material reality of B-29's cruising beyond defensive reach. Between November 1944 and March 1945, American strategic bombing continued from high altitude with mixed tactical results but devastating strategic impact. Precision bombing remained difficult due to jet stream winds that scattered ordnance. Individual raids destroyed relatively small percentages of targeted facilities, but the cumulative effect was inexorable. Japanese war production declined monthly. Transportation networks degraded. Worker morale collapsed as civilians witnessed their inability to defend against attackers they could barely see. The psychological toll on Japanese anti-aircraft crews was particularly severe. Men like Captain Yamamoto and Sergeant Suzuki had been trained to believe in Japanese military superiority. They had been told that spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage. They had expected to defend their homeland through skill and courage. Instead, they stood at their gun positions day after day, firing shells that exploded harmlessly below silver bombers that droned overhead with mechanical indifference. Suzuki's diary entries from December 1944 through February 1945 chart a descent from determination to resignation. Early entries express confidence that improved tactics and better ammunition would achieve results. Mid-December entries note frustration that direct hits rarely brought down B-29's. January entries discuss rumors that new guns with higher altitude reach were being deployed. February entries abandon hope entirely. Suzuki writes simply that his men fire their guns because orders demand it, not because anyone expects to hit anything. The civilian population's response mirrored military despair. Early B-29 raids produced panic and chaos as air raid sirens sent millions seeking shelter. By January 1945, many Tokyo residents no longer bothered taking cover during high-altitude raids. They watched from streets and rooftops as anti-aircraft bursts marked the sky thousands of feet below the bomber formations. Some expressed anger at military leadership that had promised defense but delivered only empty gestures. Others fell into fatalistic acceptance that nothing could stop the American bombers. March 9th to 10th, 1945, marked the strategic bombing campaign's transformation from high-altitude precision attacks to low-altitude area bombardment. General Curtis LeMay, commanding 21st Bomber Command, ordered a radical tactical shift. 334 B-29's would attack Tokyo at night, from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, carrying incendiary bombs designed to start fires in the city's densely packed residential and light industrial districts. The decision exposed bombers to heavier anti-aircraft fire from guns that could not reach high-altitude formations. But LeMay calculated correctly that Japanese night defenses were weak and that lower altitude eliminated the turbocharger stress, engine overheating issues, and fuel consumption that plagued high-altitude operations. Most significantly, lower altitude allowed each bomber to carry vastly more ordnance. Operation Meeting House devastated Tokyo. In 3 hours, American bombers dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries. Firestorms developed, creating winds that sucked oxygen from shelters and generated temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. An estimated 100,000 people died. 16 square miles of the city burned to ash. Only 14 B-29's were lost remarkably low given the raid's intensity. For anti-aircraft crews like Yamamoto's and Suzuki's, the low-altitude raids represented an even more bitter irony. Their guns could finally reach the targets. Type 88 batteries engaged B-29's at altitudes well within effective range. Some bombers were hit, some crashed, but the vast majority completed their bomb runs and returned safely to base, despite flying through defensive fire that should have been lethal. The problem was volume and sophistication. Tokyo possessed approximately 500 anti-aircraft guns of all types, the heaviest concentration in Japan. This seemed substantial until compared with German cities like Berlin or Hamburg, which fielded thousands of guns in integrated defensive networks with radar, direction, and predicted barrage zones. Japanese guns fired individually with visual aiming. They lacked the density to create truly lethal defensive zones. They lacked the fire control to achieve high hit probabilities, even at favorable altitudes. Suzuki's diary entry for March 10th describes firing his Type 88 continuously as bombers passed overhead. His battery expended every round in its magazine over 200 shells. He believes, though cannot confirm, that his crew scored hits on at least 2 B-29's. Both bombers continued flying, disappearing into the smoke-filled sky above burning Tokyo. Around him, the city transformed into an inferno. The fires his guns were supposed to prevent consuming everything within miles of his position. By dawn on March 10th, Suzuki and his crew had abandoned their gun position, fleeing the advancing firestorm. The Type 88 remained at its emplacement, loaded and ready to fire, while Tokyo burned around it. Suzuki's final diary entry from that night consists of a single sentence. "We could finally reach them, and it did not matter." The strategic bombing campaign continued through August 1945, expanding to include dozens of Japanese cities. Incendiary raids alternated with renewed high-altitude precision attacks on specific industrial targets. B-29, operations from Iwo Jima after its capture in March, added fighter escorts P-51 Mustangs that made Japanese interceptor operations even more suicidal. The cumulative destruction systematically dismantled Japan's capacity to wage war. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses never achieved effectiveness against the B-29 campaign. Total B-29 losses from all causes combat, mechanical failure, operational accidents numbered approximately 514 aircraft from over 33,000 combat sorties. Loss rates hovered around 1.5%, sustainable indefinitely given American .TP production capacity. Japanese defenders, by contrast, lost thousands of fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft crew members killed in action, losses they could not replace. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, represented the culmination of B-29 strategic bombing. Both atomic weapons were delivered by superfortresses flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet altitudes that Japanese anti-aircraft guns still could not effectively reach, even in the war's final week. The Enola Gay over Hiroshima and Bockscar over Nagasaki completed their missions without encountering effective defensive fire. Japanese observers on the ground watched the lone bombers with the same helplessness Captain Yamamoto had felt on November 1, 1944, watching Tokyo Rose photograph his city. Captain Yamamoto survived the war. His Type 88 battery had been destroyed, not by combat, but by American bombing that demolished the Nakajima plant it defended. Yamamoto was reassigned to coastal defense duties in July 1945, manning obsolete guns against an amphibious invasion that never came. After Japan's surrender, he spent 2 years in Yokohama, helping American occupation forces catalog captured Japanese military equipment. In 1947, Yamamoto provided testimony to American strategic bombing survey teams investigating the air campaign's effectiveness. His statement, preserved in survey archives, addresses the altitude question directly. Japanese anti-aircraft guns, he explained, were designed for an earlier era of warfare. They reflected assumptions about bomber performance that became obsolete before the Pacific War began. Japan recognized this obsolescence and attempted to develop better weapons, but lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. When asked whether anything could have made Japanese anti-aircraft defenses more effective against B-29's, Yamamoto responded that only guns capable of reaching 35,000 feet consistently, deployed in numbers measuring thousands rather than hundreds, integrated with radar fire control and adequate ammunition supplies, could have challenged American bombers. Japan possessed none of these capabilities, and, given its industrial limitations and the American bombing campaign's effects on Japanese production, could never have developed them during the war's timeframe. Sergeant Suzuki's diary, recovered by occupation forces and eventually deposited in Japanese military archives, concludes with entries from mid-August 1945. He describes Tokyo as a wasteland of ash and rubble. His anti-aircraft unit, what remains of it, has been disbanded. His gun no longer exists, melted in the fires that consumed the battery position. He writes that he and his surviving crew members await whatever comes next, having spent 9 months firing thousands of shells at bombers they could not reach, defending a city they could not save. The altitude gap between B-29 operational ceiling and Japanese anti-aircraft capability represented more than a technical disparity. It embodied the broader industrial and technological chasm that separated American and Japanese war-making capacity. The same industrial system that produced turbochargers, enabling high-altitude flight, produced them by the tens of thousands. The same manufacturing precision that built B-29's built them at rates exceeding 1 per day. The same organizational capability that coordinated strategic bombing campaigns, coordinated logistics chains spanning the Pacific. Japan faced an opponent that could engineer solutions to problems Japan barely understood, then mass-produce those solutions on scales Japan could not comprehend. American bombers flew at altitudes Japanese guns could not reach, because American industry could manufacture the precision components that enabled high-altitude flight. Japanese industry could not produce comparable components in quantity because it lacked the raw materials, machine tools, manufacturing techniques, and organizational systems that American industry possessed. The human cost of this disparity was measured in hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians killed in B-29 raids, in thousands of Japanese military personnel who died manning defenses they knew were inadequate, in American aircrews lost on missions where altitude provided protection but not invulnerability, in the continuation of a war that might have ended sooner had Japanese leaders recognized earlier that material superiority had become decisive in modern industrial warfare. When B-29's cruised at 30,000 feet or above over Japanese cities, their crews looked down on a nation that could see them clearly but could not touch them. Japanese anti-aircraft crews looked up at silver bombers trailing white contrails and fired shells that exploded thousands of feet short of their targets. The distance between those shells and those bombers was measured in feet and meters, but it represented a gap in industrial capability, technological sophistication, and material resources that no amount of courage could bridge. Captain Yamamoto, standing at his gun position on November 1, 1944, watching Tokyo Rose photograph his city from unreachable altitude, understood this truth before most. His report that day, enemy aircraft altitude exceeded maximum effective range of available weapons, would be repeated in thousands of variants by thousands of Japanese defenders, who learned that altitude advantage conferred by superior technology could determine military outcomes as surely as any battle. The altitude Japanese could not reach was not merely a physical distance, it was the measurable expression of American industrial might and Japanese industrial limitation. When those silver B-29's flew overhead, beyond the reach of desperate gunfire, they carried more than bombs. They carried proof that modern warfare had become an industrial competition, and that in such competition, material advantage trumped spiritual determination, courage, and sacrifice. Japan never expected this reality. Once understood, there was nothing Japan could do to change it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.